Hello, I'm Robert Ellsberg, the publisher of Orbis Books. I'm very glad to be joined today by one of our new authors. Well, not new, we published him before, but Adam Bucko, who is an Episcopal priest. He's worked for many years with the homeless and LGBTQ youth in New York City. He's director of the Center for Spiritual Imagination at the Cathedral of the Incarnation in Garden City, New York, which is in Long Island. And he's been a proponent of a movement called the New Monasticism, which was, in fact, the title of a book that he co-authored previously with Orbis. His new book, which I can't recommend highly enough, is called Let Your Heartbreak Be Your Guide, Lessons in Engaged Contemplation. That's a rather slim book that might look as if it's something you could read very quickly, but the stories and the reflections, meditations in this book, each of them is something that you could spend a whole day thinking about. As the title suggests, many of them are heartbreaking. I would say heart-opening. But I would like to begin, Adam, by asking you about the subtitle, Lessons in Engaged Contemplation. Many of the stories are autobiographical. Many of them take place in situations where you've been in your native Poland or in India or among the poor and marginalized people. What does engaged contemplation mean for you?
Well, first of all, Robert, thank you for an opportunity to share here, for inviting me. I've been a big fan of your writings for a very long time, so it's a great joy and privilege to be in conversation with you.
Thank you.
In terms of engaged contemplation, I think it would be best for me to talk about it in a kind of autobiographical way. I got into contemplative spirituality very early in life. In fact, when I was 19 years old, I ended up at a Hindu monastery in the US. That was a place of interfaith dialogue and where people like Thomas Keating and Brother David Steindl-Rast, but also leaders of other traditions would just periodically stop by to offer teachings. As a 19-year-old who grew up in Poland during the totalitarian regime, absorbing a lot of trauma and etc., I was very drawn to this idea that I can move beyond words, that I can enter this great silence and experience the divine as this kind of a freeing presence that could release me from all the pain that I've witnessed in my life, And so I spent 10 years or so practicing that and really tasting what that peace feels like. But at some point, I remember meeting this Carmelite hermit who said something like, the first step in a mystical life is to fall in love with life. Mm-hmm. And I remember looking at myself and realizing that not only was I not in love in life, I was barely alive, Mm-hmm. I kept on detaching and disengaging from parts of my past, from parts of myself, to the point that there was very little left. But that produced this sort of almost like a spiritual coma. So when I went to India initially to continue on a contemplative path, I started working with homeless youth. I met a homeless girl that really in many ways changed my life and brought me back to earth. And through that, I discovered a different way of prayer, a way of prayer that could allow me to gather all of the marginalized parts of myself, parts of my life, parts of my experience, especially my pain, bring all of that to God and somehow rest with all of that in the divine presence. And what I began experiencing is that when that happens, God literally picks up the broken pieces of our lives, all of those things that are kind of broken and lying on the floor, and reassembles them into something that then becomes our vehicle of engaging with the world, connecting to the pain in the world, and hopefully bringing healing into the world. And so when I say engaged contemplation, I essentially talk about that intersection of contemplation and action. In the Christian tradition, we've had a little bit of a difficulty with that. In some ways, for a very long time, we thought that contemplation is the highest path. And of course, in the 20th century, people like Merton and Dorothy Day and others kind of helped us to understand that contemplation and action can be related. And so what I've discovered in my life, that contemplation is about receptivity. It's about bringing everything that I am and have to God and being there in a receptive state, in a state of openness, in a state of curious not knowing. And then what happens, there's this impulse of God that begin to arise in us. And our job is to say yes to it. And when we say yes to it, God begins literally or metaphorically to live through us, taking whatever we have, transforming it into something that can become our gift to the world. And so in my view these days, not only contemplation and action can be connected, but action can become contemplation if it comes out of that kind of receptive being, receptive living, contemplative living, where we can show up in a state of yes and allow God to essentially begin to live and work and even protest through us. I remember this beautiful phrase from St. Augustine, who talked about a sleeping Christ in the most inner cabin of our hearts. And I think that that's what we're talking about, that Christ waking up and us beginning to say yes to him taking over our lives. So that's kind of what I'm trying to get at this book, showing how I failed many times at this, showing how heartbreak and being with people, accompanying people into the depths of their suffering, especially homeless youth, how that kind of in some ways opened me to that grace of God, that presence of God, that is always there, but we often don't notice it.
Well, we could end right there, but that opens up so many questions. I think a lot of people feel that the spiritual life is a way of getting away from our brokenness, transcending it somehow, finding some place of peace or stillness or holiness that is separate from that kind of messiness or confusion in our lives. But you kind of tell these stories that show how those inner wounds or broken places in ourselves can actually be a kind of vehicle or a doorway to the healing or the wholeness. I wonder, as we move toward that wholeness, do we carry the brokenness with us, or is it always there?
I think it is. Perhaps it maybe feels a little different, but a good example would be someone that I think you knew very well, Henry Nouwen, who in some ways, as I began working with the poor, especially in India, it's through reading his journals that I feel like I received that permission to really reconnect with all the messiness of my life, And so I know my brokenness is still with me, but somehow I think I see it now maybe as an opening for God's grace to come in to my life. And then as a result, maybe me, at least sometimes, being able to show up for others in whatever imperfect way I can,
The title, Let Your Heartbreak Be Your Guide, actually comes in a story that is about vocation. And I guess maybe it was an idea of a thought that came from Andrew Harvey, but opposed to that idea that you should follow your passion or follow your bliss, follow the thing that makes you feel passionate. He said you should let your heartbreak be your guide. You shared that with a young woman who was in a kind of a time of vocational discernment, Could you say a little bit more about what that means in terms of vocation?
Yes. So I think in some ways, when it comes to vocational discernment, I oftentimes actually relate it to the four paths of creation spirituality that Matthew Fox articulated: via negativa, via positiva, via creativa, and via transformativa. I started working with this idea of following your heartbreak when I was working with homeless youth. The center that I was part of, the Reciprocity Foundation, the organization that is still working in New York City, we wanted to set up a space where kids could be asked important questions, where kids could be loved, where kids could enter the space and feel that they are being received. And one of the questions that we started working with is, what breaks your heart? And the other one was, what makes you truly alive? And I noticed that as I started working with those young people, helping them to kind of hold those two questions of aliveness and heartbreak, but like really holding them with every cell of their being, like staying with that question for a week or 2 weeks and engaging in spiritual direction with them in these kinds of prayerful one-on-one meetings. What I discovered is that as they held their heartbreak and their aliveness, like something would crack in them. It was almost like the operating system stopped for a moment, that kind of runs their life. And there would be this kind of aha moment, an infusion of something. And in those moments, they would get insights about what they want their lives to be. And so for me, that's what a vocation is, that something that what I call the impulse of God that breaks through, and all of a sudden we can see our lives, even if just for a moment, with new eyes, hopefully with God's eyes. And so the way that I talk about it is, the heartbreak is the via negativa. The aliveness, the question that comes from Howard Thurman, is via positiva. And when you work with both of them, when the operating system stops, it leads to via creativa. And then via transformativa is us kind of looking at the insights that we've received about our lives. Via transformativa is really a test. As I see my life now, is it going to be serving compassion and justice, or is it going to be serving something else? And, the test is, if it is serving compassion, justice, and beauty, that means that perhaps it is truly a true insight, a sense of God whispering something to us about what our lives need to be. Because in my experience, every authentic vocation contributes to, to compassion and justice. Now, you asked about the heartbreak, and in the book, I kind of say, don't follow your passion, don't follow your bliss. In some ways, it's not wrong to follow those. But in my experience, it's helpful to actually start with the heartbreak. And especially in our culture in the West, when so much emphasis is focused on, feeling good and being passionate and making sure that, that we're in bliss. Andrew Harvey calls kind of the New Age community the bliss bunnies, because so much of it is focused on articulating positive thoughts and etc. And some of it is not bad. I mean, it's not wrong to have a positive outlook on life and etc. But in my experience, it's really the heartbreak that allows us to touch something very authentic about where we need to be, and perhaps where our aliveness needs to meet the heartbreak of the world.
I think that I have a sense that a lot of the book was written in the context of COVID, the pandemic, which I think you kind of referred to as a sort of a dark night enveloping, humanity. I wonder, as we are sort of emerging from that, what do you think are the lessons that this experience might have taught us, lessons that we may have learned or have failed to learn?
Yes. A lot of the book initially, some of the notes that I used for the book were essentially notes from sermons that I delivered at a Zoom church, because at that time, in the first weeks of the pandemic, we were not necessarily meeting in person. So I was trying to use these stories to, I think, help people to kind of touch into something in their lives, to help them connect with God. In terms of the lessons, in many ways, we were all forced to have a little bit of a monastic way of life. For the first few weeks and few months of the pandemic, especially in New York City, where things were very scary. And I think so many of us, as a result, were able to touch something deeper in our lives. And it's interesting, and I say that in the book, that initial year of the pandemic had record numbers of people going to national parks, spending time in nature. In LA, people were all of a sudden able to see the stars, because there was not as much pollution. And I think that all of us, or at least some of us, those of us who were privileged enough to be able to have that kind of, safe experience of COVID, where we had homes and etc., and access to food, which that was not the case for a lot of people. But I think those of us who had that privilege in some ways touched something deeper about our lives. And I know quite a few people who, as a result, decided to change jobs or went back to school, or just really realized that they no longer want to live in a world governed by schedules and social media and other things. And so I think that we definitely experience that, the mandatory withdrawal allowed us to connect with something deeper. At the same time, when I look at the world, I think that a lot of the lessons that we initially tasted or learned, in some ways, we are now going back to normal. We're sort of pretending that COVID is no longer really a thing. A lot of the injustices are still continuing, or even getting worse. We loved kind of gathering and clapping for all the essential workers and applauding their courage. At the same time, not many of us got involved in a movement to make sure that those people are making a livable wage and etc., that they have health insurance. And so I think that in some ways, COVID was a very tragic event, but I think it was also, in a way, an initiation. And my sense is that as a society, we probably largely missed the opportunities that experience gave us, and that is unfortunate.
Many of your reflections are refer to stories from the Gospels. I was interested in the attention you give to the parable of the lost sheep and the lost coin. And you said that in the early church, Christians saw this as a metaphor for themselves, for their own lives. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that.
Yes, I think that parable shows up a couple of times in the book, and I think that parable has been was very alive for me during the time of COVID. To me, the parable of a lost sheep indicates how easy it is for us to just kind of take off on our own and maybe not even notice it. I know when I look at my life, sometimes I tend to think that the grass is greener where I am not. And I think that this metaphor of a lost sheep really reassures me that our God is a God who is longing to look for us and to find us and to embrace us as we are, even with all of our stuff, all of our mistakes. It also points to the fact that we are meant to travel together as a community, and that this community perhaps is a community of vulnerability where we can be mirrors for each other, where mirrors that let us see who we are in Christ, in God. And the lost coin, I think, is very significant because, like the coin has arguably, an image of a king or, be it the president or whatever in it. And I think early Christians didn't hesitate to compare that to us being made in the image and likeness of God. But yet, when that lost coin is lost, it can't really return itself. And so for me, again, it's that symbol for God and also community, how so much of our lives is really about removing that dust from our hearts so we can get to that divine spark of life, divine spark of light. And then with the community, begin to cultivate that, begin to grow that. So our souls, our compassion, so our connectedness to others can grow. So that's kind of how I'm seeing it, and I think some of it, I think I say in the book, maybe in a bit more articulate way.
Well, thank you, Adam Bucko. This has been a great conversation, and I think will give people quite a flavor of the depth and the wisdom that is in this book. Let Your Heartbreak Be Your Guide, Lessons in Engaged Contemplation. Published, I'm glad to say, by Orbis Books, and I certainly hope not the last book we work on together. Thank you.
Robert, thank you so much. Thank you so much.